Tonight on Bridge City News, as recreational use pot is set to become legal on Wednesday, RCMP and our province say they're prepared to deal with drivers who want to drive high. We chatted with a professor at the U of L who discusses the negative impact marijuana has on your brain. And the AHS has a warning for us in regards to Chin Lakes near Taber. We will explain why. Good evening. Thanks so much for joining us. Alberta's Mounties say they are ready once recreational use marijuana becomes legal on Wednesday. There are more than 400 officers trained to do field testing and another 42 trained as drug recognition experts. RCMP spokesperson Brad Mueller says they will also bring in 4 of the federally approved roadside marijuana test devices deployed across the province. Mueller says the RCMP will also work with other government agencies and police forces to increase capacity in areas including prevention, intelligence, security screening, and training. Mueller says the Cannabis Act, or Bill C-45, represents a significant change in enforcement, but they are ready. As for the RCMP smoking pot themselves, they have to abstain for 28 days before reporting for duty. The same goes for police in Toronto. Calgary police will not be allowed to use cannabis at all while off the job. Dr. Robin Gibb, who's a neuroscientist at the University of Lethbridge, says the THC from pot can have a negative impact on your health, including the potential of developing schizophrenia.
Depending on your genetic makeup, some people are more vulnerable to the effects of THC than others. And if you happen to have a vulnerability, it can increase your likelihood of developing a mental health disorder like schizophrenia or depression quite a bit. So it can increase it by 3 times up to 15 times more likely to develop such disorders if you happen to have that kind of a genetic vulnerability.
Gibb also says those who do use marijuana in adolescence are 6 times more likely to become dependent on the drug. Alberta Health Services is warning the public to stay out of the water at Chin Lake. A blue-green algae bloom was identified in the Chin Lake area recently near the reservoir. AHS is warning us to take proper precautions by not going into the water, not to drink the water, and to limit how much fish you eat from the lake. The AHS says if you do come in contact with the water, watch for some signs of illness and rashes.
You've been in contact with the water, then you can get things like skin irritation or sore throat or sore eyes or swelling of the lips. So that's more like contact. If you've accidentally consumed water with blue-green algae, then you can feel more systemic effects like headaches or diarrhea or fever, even vomiting, muscle aches, cramps in the abdomen.
The Chin Lake Reservoir is located south of Taber, west of Highway 36. Alberta Premier Rachel Notley announced recently that $70 million will be added to our province's legal aid program over the next 4 years. Notley says the support will ensure that low-income Albertans can access the justice system. Last year, over 60,000 Albertans used legal aid. More than a third of the cases dealt with family matters. The Alberta provincial election is coming up next spring. Some say the election is Jason Kenney's to lose, but others say Premier Rachel Notley still has a lot of support. So we hit the streets of Lethbridge and asked if the election was held today, who would you vote for?
I would vote for the NDP again for what our Premier has done on the oil front. Nobody's expected that she would support
Jason Kenney and the UCP party because he seems to be supporting a lot of the farms, the farming communities, and around here, farming communities are massive.
Rachel Notley's team has done a fabulous job in this province, and she came into a very tough situation.
Jason Kenney, because I feel like he would be the best in representing Alberta and getting those pipelines through.
You know, the pipeline didn't get built. Carbon tax is a nightmare. So, yeah, change of government, definitely.
And we asked the same question on our Bridge City News Facebook page, and the reaction was also split. Lucretia in Lethbridge says she will be voting NDP and thinks Premier Notley deserves another 4 years, while Ewan in Calgary says he'll be voting UCP. Ewan says if you've lived in Alberta for the past 3 years and you think things are better, you work for the NDP. Police in Edmonton are investigating after a woman was found dead at an apartment complex. A man was also taken to hospital. Police were called to a building west of downtown yesterday morning. Officers found the elderly woman dead and the man suffering from non-life-threatening injuries. Police say they're not looking for any suspects. One person died and many others were injured in a crash between a truck and an SUV in Saskatchewan. RCMP say the 2 vehicles collided in the northbound lane of Highway 47 west of Yorkton on Saturday. The driver of the SUV was dead at the scene while 3 other people from the truck were taken to hospitals in Yorkton and Regina. Police say they're still investigating the crash. Organizers in Saskatchewan with the new People's Party of Canada held their first electoral district meeting in the province. The meeting held in Prince Albert elected interim representatives for the local riding. Kelly Day, who was appointed president of the new interim association, says she plans to put her name forward as a local party candidate once the party becomes official. The PPC was started by Quebec MP Maxime Bernier after he resigned from the Conservative Party. We chatted with the head of the People's Party of Canada, Maxime Bernier, recently about how he intends on stealing some support from the Tories, Liberals, and the NDP.
If you're a conservative and you believe in conservative reform, you must come with us. And I had a lot of support. I have a lot of support from former conservative members, so that's great. But also I'm saying to the NDP, who want to get rid of supply management because it's a regressive tax on poor, they are welcome in our party. The NDP supporters who voted NDP, but they want to get rid of corporate welfare. We're the only party in Parliament that want to get rid of that. They're welcome in our party. And some Liberals also that voted Liberals during Jean Chrétien and Paul Martin for a balanced budget and lower taxes. That's not the Liberal Party of Canada right now. They're welcome in our party. So we want to build a strong coalition. And also people who don't believe in politicians anymore. There's 30% of the population in Canada who did not vote at the last election at the federal level because they don't believe anymore in politicians.
The federal election takes place in the fall of next year. Authorities say a pilot is dead after a small plane crashed into a home in Payson, Arizona. Federal Aviation Administration officials did not know why the single-engine plane crashed on Saturday. Fortunately, no injuries were reported on the ground.
Didn't know what it was, but it just boom, and then the front glass went flying out into the front yard. There was nothing moving in that mess. Well, everybody didn't know what the hell to do. Walked into the bedroom, which used to be a bedroom, and now it's out in the backyard. And so is the bathroom, and so is the walk-in closet.
It was scary and emotional, but you think about it, and it's like 300 yards away, it would have been my house.
I found my cat hiding in its back bedroom, which I was very concerned about, naturally, and picked up my medicine and a few other things. Some people say, oh, divine this and that. Well, who knows?
Relief efforts are being hampered by a lack of telecommunications in parts of Florida hit hard by Hurricane Michael. Florida Governor Rick Scott says 17,000 utility workers are working to restore power. There are also another 2,000 telecommunications workers trying to restore service.
I'm very hopeful that everybody is going to be found, and everybody's going to be found alive, and everybody's going to survive this. But there's a process that they go through where it goes through the medical examiner's office, and so as they get information, we'll be putting out information quickly. We're starting to see more of our power get on. We have about 17,000 utility workers working on power around the state. So the way I think about it is, number one, search and rescue. We're still completing that. Number two, make sure we get food and water and fuel out. We're doing that. We just got to make sure everybody knows where it is. Number three, we've tried to get generators out to all the counties to make sure that they can get their stoplights back on, even if they don't get their power back on. One of the most frustrating things, I think, for all of us right now is that anybody doesn't have power on. That's very frustrating. But the other is just telecommunications. We put a lot of food and water out all across the state. Well, if you have no internet and you have no cell phone, it's hard to get the information out.
When it comes to immigration and allowing thousands of asylum seekers into Canada, there's one former professor from Simon Fraser University who says it's not a good idea. Herbert Grubel says when we take the brightest and best that Syria has to offer, we're doing that country a disservice.
We are not doing the people of Syria a service by taking the best, the brightest, the most energetic, the healthiest. We go into these refugee camps and pick them out and send them to Canada. We should responsibly finance and make life as comfortable as possible in these refugee camps and encourage them. And what they all want to do, they all want to go home to rebuild their country.
Watch my full interview with Mr. Grubel as we discuss illegal border crossers and how it's impacting Canadians coming up in the second half of our show. U.S. President Donald Trump says road killers may be responsible for what happened to missing Washington Post columnist Jamal Khashoggi. Khashoggi disappeared from the Saudi Arabian consulate in Turkey earlier this month.
I just spoke with the King of Saudi Arabia, who denies any knowledge of what took place with regard to, as he said, his Saudi Arabian citizen. I've asked, and he firmly denied that, I've asked Secretary of State Mike Pompeo to immediately get on a plane, go to Saudi Arabia, go to other places if necessary, which he probably will, but with regard to this, go to Turkey if necessary. The king told me that Turkey and Saudi Arabia are working hand in hand very closely on getting to the bottom of what happened. We are going to leave nothing uncovered. With that being said, the king firmly denied any knowledge of it. He didn't really know. Maybe, I don't want to get into his mind, but it sounded to me like maybe these could have been rogue killers. Who knows?
The war to drive the Islamic State group out of Iraq has left tens of thousands of orphans. As we see in this next report, the struggle toward a normal life is difficult for the children of Islamic State families.
Cancer took Dalat Suleiman's mother from her. Then the Islamic State group stole her childhood. The Iraqi girl hasn't seen her father since security forces arrested him last year for being a member of IS. At just 12 years old, Dalat has been forced to become a surrogate parent to 5 of her siblings.
أغسل إيش اسمه أزفت الفراش هو وسوى رأيوك أخوتي بخير أمكم يروحون يلعبون وأنا أرتب البيت وأغسل مواعين.
The 3-year war against the self-declared caliphate has left tens of thousands of orphans. But the children of IS-linked families, like Dalat and her siblings, face unique challenges. Not only was their father an IS member, but the oldest brother died fighting for the group. After driving IS out of their northern Iraqi village, Shiite militiamen burned down the family's home. The children dare not return. 18-year-old Salah, the oldest surviving son, was beaten by IS, then by the Kurds to whom he'd fled for protection. As the war-torn country rebuilds, Iraqis struggle with how to care for a generation spawned by jihad. Many are in overcrowded orphanages, where guardians work to turn them away from the extremism that marked their formative years. Untold others live in the displaced camps dotting the landscape. Aid worker Alexandra Sayas says the camps are not a sustainable long-term solution.
There needs to be serious reconciliation efforts taking place at the local level to ensure that children and the families of perceived or alleged ISIS affiliates are eventually allowed back into their communities, or that a solution is found so that they can rebuild their lives elsewhere.
The Suleiman children lived in a camp for nearly a year before a relative arranged for them to move to this ramshackle apartment in the city of Kirkuk. Each day, Salah goes out in search of work. No longer a boy, but the man of the house.
كون عائلة كبرهم أجمع العائلة ألمهم ما خليهم يتنثرون مثل ما قبل كانوا متنثرين حتى بحيث أكون أنا أب وأم لهم يعني.
As for Dalat, she just wants to be an ordinary girl again.
أحب المدرسة وتعلم ودرس أعرف أكتب تعرف أكتب اللي أريد وأصير دكتورة معلمة أي شيء.
Even amid the loss and ruins, dreams survive. Alan Breed, Associated Press.
Prince Harry and his wife Meghan, the Duchess of Sussex, arrived in Sydney today, just before Kensington Palace announced the royal couple is expecting a child in the spring. Outside Buckingham Palace, tourists wish them well.
That's fabulous. We're all very pleased. Yeah. We knew it was coming soon.
Yeah, it's so cool that she's having a baby. It's super exciting.
Yeah, but they certainly didn't waste any time, did they?
No, absolutely. So didn't get to enjoy married life just as a couple for too long, but yeah, it'd be gorgeous with a child.
Congratulations to the royal couple. A gorgeous couple and a gorgeous week is shaping up weather-wise. I'll have the weather details coming up in just a moment. A beautiful day in Lethbridge, lots of sunshine today, just a few clouds developing tonight with a low near -1. Tomorrow sunny and warm with a high near 17 expected. Pretty much the same picture on Wednesday. The mercury drops slightly on Thursday to 15 and slightly cooler on Friday, sunshine and a high of 12. Saturday, an incredible day is shaping up, sunshine and a high near 22 is expected. Looking at the almanac, the average high for this time of year is 15 degrees and an average low of 1. The highest temperature on this date was recorded in 1961 at 27 degrees, and the record low was minus 13 in 2001. Sunrise was at 7:53, sunset at 6:42. Let's have a look at how tomorrow is shaping up across the country. Vancouver will be mainly sunny and 16. Even warmer in Victoria on Tuesday, sunshine and a high near 19 is expected. A clear sky and 15 for Calgary. Edmonton will have loads of sunshine and 15 degrees as well. A mixture of sun and cloud in Regina tomorrow with a high near 9. Mainly cloudy and 10 is expected in Saskatoon. A chance of flurries is expected for Winnipeg tomorrow and a high of 3. Over in the central part of the country, Toronto will be mainly cloudy and 12. Ottawa will also be overcast and 9. Montreal will be mainly cloudy and 9 degrees. In the Maritimes, Fredericton, New Brunswick will have sunshine mixed with cloud and a high of 11. Halifax, Nova Scotia will have rain and 13. Charlottetown, PEI was under a wind warning today. Tomorrow, rain and a high of 10. And in St. John's, Newfoundland, rain is also expected and a high of 14 degrees. Sears in the United States has filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. The 130-year-old company has been buckling under its massive debt load and staggering losses.
There's very little value in the brand. I mean, some of the assets they had in terms of Craftsman and other, really iconic brands that were in the store, I mean, they were very successful with those, and yet with the lack of support, with the business relationships they've tried to kind of parse out, could we sell this brand in this store, could we emphasize this but not that, it's been done so poorly that people don't even think about what were once these iconic Sears brands. It's not really a place where people have been buying lots of things for a long time.
A survey by Canada's central bank says most companies are predicting faster sales growth over the next year. The poll by the Bank of Canada found that business sentiment in Canada was running at near record levels, especially in terms of sales growth and foreign demand. The study of senior managers from 100 firms was conducted between August and September. This was before Canada agreed to the new trade deal with the United States and Mexico, which has since alleviated some of the economic uncertainty. Alberta now has a minimum wage of $15 an hour. Some feel it is a real help to fight poverty, while others say it's simply a job killer. Steve Lafleur is the senior policy analyst for the Fraser Institute, and he says minimum wage has a major impact on those under the age of 24, especially single moms. But he's not so sure it will eliminate poverty altogether.
2.1% are actually single mothers, for instance. So when we look at trying to alleviate poverty, we really need to focus on the people who really need the most help and try to find specific targeted ways to help them. And the minimum wage doesn't really do that and can also have negative effects on young unemployed workers.
Catch the full interview with Steve Lafleur and our own Paul Arthur discussing the pros and cons of Alberta's minimum wage increase coming up after business news. More major players in international finance are pulling out of a high-profile business conference in Saudi Arabia. It follows reports a Washington Post writer, critical of the government, disappeared and is feared dead after entering the Saudi consulate in Turkey. You can include Jamie Dimon, chief executive of JP Morgan Chase & Company, who backed out. Ford Motor Company also confirmed that executive chairman Bill Ford will also not attend. Turkish officials say a Saudi hit team killed news writer Jamal Khashoggi. Allegations Saudi officials say are baseless. Now, here's a look at today's markets. Recapping one of our top stories this hour, the RCMP in Alberta say they are preparing to deal with drivers who are caught while driving under the influence of marijuana. Pot is set to become legal in our province and across the country on Wednesday of this week. There are more than 400 officers trained to do field testing and another 42 trained as drug recognition experts. When you see news happening, drop us an email at info@bridgecitynews.ca. And if you missed any of today's top stories, check out our full newscast online at bridgecitynews.ca. Does Alberta's new minimum wage of $15 an hour have a real impact on curbing poverty in our province? Steve Lafleur, Senior Policy Analyst with the Fraser Institute, gives us his thoughts next. But first, here's a look at what's happening in and around your community.
Here's your Bridge City News community calendar. Are you interested in getting to know people from different cultures? Volunteer Lethbridge is holding information sessions on October 18th and 20th. Find out how you can make a difference in a newcomer's life by supporting their transition to Lethbridge. For more information, call Shelley at 403-332-4320 or email office@volunteerlethbridge.com. Come to the Great Canadian Garage Sale at the Lethbridge Exhibition Park's main pavilion on October 27th beginning at 8:30 a.m. Take in a number of private garage sales in one location, offering unique items and tons of treasures, from household items to furniture and more. Booth rentals are free and can be done online at greatcanadiangaragesale.com. Admission is $8 or $6 with a non-perishable food donation to the Lethbridge Food Bank. And on the same day at Exhibition Park's West Pavilion, come to the free family event called The Boo Bash, taking place from 1 to 4 p.m. Kids will enjoy bouncy castles, face painting, a photo booth, roving gym, and much more. The Boo Bash, Saturday, October 27th at the Exhibition Park's West Pavilion. And that's your Bridge City News community calendar.
Alberta now has the highest minimum wage in the country at $15 per hour. While Ontario's new premier is holding back an increase to that same rate for now, some believe it's a real help to fight poverty. Others see it as a job killer. Joining me now is Steve Lafleur, Senior Policy Analyst with the Fraser Institute. Now, as part of the effort to reduce poverty, Premier Rachel Notley's NDP government raising Alberta's minimum wage to $15 an hour, and that's up from $10.20 3 years ago. Steve, do you think this actually helps families living in poverty? Are there some studies to back that up at all?
Well, I think the first thing we need to do when looking at a question like this is to figure out who's actually making the minimum wage. While there's the idea, the popular kind of conception that most minimum wage earners are low-income people such as single mothers, the reality is that 90% of people, or more than 90% of people on the minimum wage, are not actually in low-income families. So it's not an especially well-targeted policy to start with. The second challenge is that what it can do by raising the cost of hiring, it can mean that some people might not get an opportunity to even get into the labor force to begin with, and which can have long-term effects. If you can't get into the labor force and get experience, it gets harder to, climb up the income ladder and get, higher paying positions to support yourself and your family.
Right, so you're saying something like 90% of people getting minimum wage are not living in poverty. So what does that mean? They're living with somebody who makes more money, their spouse, significant other, that sort of thing, or how does that work?
So, for instance, 50% of people earning the minimum wage are 24 and under and live with families. So that's one thing. So, obviously, some of those people, it would be helpful for them to earn more wages, but they're also not at the bottom of the spectrum. They're not people who are struggling to make rent. Whereas 2.1% are actually single mothers, for instance. So when we look at trying to alleviate poverty, we really need to focus on the people who really need the most help and try to find specific targeted ways to help them. And the minimum wage doesn't really do that and can also have negative effects on young unemployed workers.
Right, that's an interesting stat you just mentioned there. If I heard you correctly, I think you said 2.1% of workers getting the minimum wage here in Alberta are the single parents with kids. That's typically what we think of, right? Going, okay, we want to instinctively, I think, help people like that. But that's incredibly low, 2.1%?
Yeah, it's a small number. But at the same time, when you think about it, $15 an hour is certainly helpful for that group of people. But maybe it's not the best way to do it. There are certainly other ways you can do it. For instance, the provincial government has the Alberta Family Tax Credit, which tops up post-tax wages, for instance. So I think that, instead of focusing on kind of a bumper sticker approach, $15 an hour, what you really want to do is really target to ensure that instead of saying, well, everybody needs to get 15, even if that means some people aren't going to get into the labor force, what I think we want to do is ensure that we have wages at a level where people can get in and then try to make sure that after tax, their take-home pay is high enough to actually support themselves if they, are living on their own and can't make ends meet, or if they have a family to take care of, which is a rare situation. But nevertheless, we need to take those concerns seriously, and just increasing the wage to $15 doesn't necessarily help that, even if it seems like an easy, convenient way to do so.
Right. Now, you had mentioned again, it looks like the higher percentage of people getting minimum wage would be the younger people. And now, what about seniors? I know there are seniors that simply want to supplement their retirement income, and they've got some time, and they put in some extra hours that way, right? Is that a fairly low percentage as well then?
There certainly are people in that boat. I don't have the entire spreadsheet in front of me, so I can't tell you the specific percentage. But there are people like that, and as I think you alluded to, it's not always the case that seniors working at low wage jobs are doing so because they're, because they simply,
Yeah, they're not starving, but they do have income coming in and maybe just want to supplement that.
And there certainly can be some who are, but also a large percentage of people who are working minimum wage also have partners who are not. So if you're a dual income couple and one is working minimum wage and the other is working more than minimum wage, then you're not in the same position as somebody who's a single income earner earning the minimum wage.
For sure. Do you have any idea of what percentage or ballpark anyway of minimum wage earners would be working part-time? And would that be simply for, by their own choice, or because that's all the hours they can get?
That's a good question. I don't have those specific statistics in front of me. I think we're focusing mainly on full-time though, because usually...
Okay, so we're talking full-time, all right.
If somebody's on part-time, they're not actually raising a family on that because it would basically be...
With a higher minimum wage, can that produce some unintended economic consequences? I think you alluded to it earlier. Certainly what comes to mind is if you're going to have a higher minimum wage, a small business owner might be saying, I might just dish out a few less hours to my employees. Maybe I'll do more of the work myself, or maybe I won't hire anybody at all for this season.
Yeah, we want to be careful about drawing conclusions from individual circumstances. Often, it's the case that people see stores closing and they say, well, that must be the minimum wage. And
right.
It certainly can contribute to it. So we don't want to be, too alarmist about it. But on the other hand, it does raise the cost of doing business. There's no question about that. And as you pointed out, if you own a small business in the service sector, it could be that instead of being able to hire somebody, you just have to work more yourself. And that can mean that somebody out there lost an opportunity that they otherwise would have had. And that's something we don't want to see happen.
Right. What about automation? Are we seeing any of that happening? Okay, so I've got to pay my workers more now. Let's find a way to save some dollars by getting some machines to do it.
Yeah, there certainly is the potential for that. The reality is that if you look at, for instance, a fast food restaurant, you see the kiosks popping up. And it could be the case that it's just more convenient to have the kiosks. And it doesn't mean that everybody's, going to lose their job. Some people there will, as far as I can tell, always be humans there. But it could mean there are a few less. And if it's much more expensive to hire human labor and there are tasks at the margins you can automate, you might just do that. And again, that's another person who doesn't get onto the first rung of the employment ladder.
Right. To what degree are we seeing companies perhaps reduce employee benefit packages to make up for the higher wages?
Yeah, that's one thing that you often see with increased minimum wages, because when we look at it, we often forget that wages are just one part of the total compensation package. So, for instance, recently Amazon had their announcement that they were going to voluntarily increase their minimum wage to $15 an hour. But then they decided to also stop giving out employee stock options and that type of thing. So you have to be careful. Just trying to pressure companies into paying more doesn't necessarily mean the total compensation will go up. It can shift how the compensation is, which might not necessarily even really be a net gain for anybody. And it can even mean that some employees, who are less senior get a benefit, whereas more senior employees lose out because they need to cut costs elsewhere.
Yeah, that's an interesting thought. Good point. Okay. Now, not all business owners would be opposed to higher minimum wages, but I do wonder if perhaps the speed of the increase, again, something like, 50% increase in 3 years, right, is simply too fast. And of course, it comes at, a difficult economic time as well, right?
Yeah, that's one of the challenges. So it's a sharp increase over a short period of time when there is significant youth unemployment. So the unemployment rate is high, but also the youth unemployment rate is quite high as well. And in particular, it seems that recessions have hit young men pretty hard in Alberta. So it makes it particularly challenging when you've got a large pool of people looking for jobs, and when the cost of hiring them is going up at the same time. And as much as we still have the highest average wages in the country, we're still not out of the clear economically. We still have 8% unemployment, so that has an impact on the service sector, where a lot of minimum wage jobs are. So we need to be really cautious about imposing too many costs on employers of minimum wage employees.
Yes, and it does follow logically as well. And now when wages go up, of course, the businesses probably would need to raise some prices to compensate in many cases. So long term, has anybody done the math on this? Will the higher wages be lost in the shuffle because the cost of living is going up as a result? So yes, you're earning more money, but it's going to cost you more for a hamburger, going to cost you a bit more at the grocery store. And again, they're maybe not huge numbers, but again, when you're not making huge dollars, does it all end up being in a wash?
Yeah, so there are a lot of studies on the impact of minimum wages and who bears the costs. In broad strokes, there are three categories of people who lose. There's employees can lose out, shareholders can lose out, and consumers can lose out. And people, there are various findings on how those are apportioned, but the reality is somebody pays for it. And if it ends up being the case that it's disproportionately borne by lower income workers, then that's a problem, and that's in two fronts. First of all, if people don't get opportunities because it's too expensive to hire them, that's one problem. Another problem, as you alluded to with costs, can be if the costs at a lot of stores that cater to lower income people have to raise their prices, then you've got another problem involved in it. I think that often the idea is that we think, well, okay, it'll be shareholders that'll pay for the entire price, but that's not really how it tends to happen. And if, it might not seem like a big deal if it costs another, 5 or 10 cents for a coffee, but the reality is people will consume less coffee and maybe less people will be hired at that particular restaurant. So we need to be really cautious about this. And, if anything, we need to make sure that we're trying to promote employment through public policy as opposed to do things that could potentially constrain it.
Okay. Another angle on this minimum wage debate is, the cookie cutter approach. And then there are some who suggest that it would be better to use an indexed minimum wage. So in big cities, they might get, yes, the $15, but in smaller centers where the cost of living is lower, the wages could also be lower, right? Now, business owners may not have the same population base needed to support that higher wage. Any thoughts on doing something like that?
It certainly could be the case. I would have to think more about how that works within the context of a single province. It could have some effects around the margins. I mean, literally at the margins of cities, for instance, where if it's cheaper to hire people just outside of the city, it might be the case that businesses will relocate there. That would be something that would really require some careful attention. I'm not sure, but as a general idea, I think it's something worth exploring. For instance, the provincial level, certainly. One of the things about the Alberta minimum wage increase that makes it a little bit easier is that average wages are higher here than in most of the country, so it's not dramatically higher as a percentage of the average wage. However, with the stubbornly high youth unemployment, that's obviously a challenge as well. But yes, I think we want to be careful about really top-down approaches to these things because the economic realities in Calgary in 2014, for instance, versus maybe I can't speak to Lethbridge very specifically, but I'm sure given how booming Calgary was at the time, I'm sure that it would have been easier to bear a higher minimum wage here during great times than during some other places. So we do have to be careful about having one size fits all approaches.
Yeah. Now, you suggested that a work-based subsidy is a more effective policy to help reduce poverty. Can you explain exactly how that would work?
Yeah, so there are a number of different models for this. There's the working income tax benefit in the United States. There's the Canadian version as well that the current government renamed, and the new name escapes me. And there's the Alberta Working Income Tax Credit. So the idea behind all of them is that what you want to do is give people tax credits so that they either don't pay taxes or actually get a net refund from taxes, so that tops up their income after taxes, as opposed to mandating that employers pay more. And the theory behind that is that way you're not discouraging people from being hired because the cost of hiring the person is the same. You're just taking more out of the public treasury and putting it into wage-based subsidies.
Is there any studies that would back that up? Is it effective?
Yeah, it's actually a pretty widely supported policy. It's one of those policies that almost goes under the radar because everybody kind of agrees on it, but often it gets overshadowed by the minimum wage because the minimum wage is, it's easier to understand, right? It's also, I think, because people assume that the minimum wage costs all go to shareholders, which they don't.
Okay. Now, these work-based subsidies, they're coming from tax dollars then, correct?
Yeah, that's the idea, yes.
Okay. And I guess it could produce perhaps an incentive to find work in that sense, right?
Oh, it certainly could. If work pays more, then greater incentive to get work versus, if for instance, if you're a two-income family and you've got a child and you're deciding whether to go back into the workforce or whether to seek childcare options, it could be the case that by making work more remunerative, you could say, okay, well, actually, the cost or the benefit of me going back to work now makes more sense. So there are all kinds of different ways in which you can tweak people's incentives by doing that. And as I said, I think it's a good idea in general to try to promote work through public policy as opposed to do things that might actually work in the other direction.
Right. Now, we have the higher minimum wages now happening across the country, and particularly in Alberta. Once it's there, it's really hard to put the horse back in the barn. So do you know of any governments that have ever tried to roll back a wage increase like that?
Well, there's the freezing of the increase of the minimum wage in Ontario.
Yeah.
In terms of rolling back, that is a good question. I'm not aware of a specific case. It wouldn't surprise me if it has happened, but certainly, I guess one of the things is that some of the recent increases in minimum wage are a lot more dramatic than it's historically been the case. Usually you don't see increases as rapidly as we've seen here. So that might make it seem more urgent for reform. We'll see. But ultimately, it's for the government of the day to decide. And if they choose to do so, there are certainly ways that they could do so and ensure that they're helping lower income workers through more targeted approaches.
Right. Okay. The targeted approach, making sure it's getting to the people who actually need it. Well, thanks so much, Steve. Steve LaFleur, Senior Policy Analyst with the Fraser Institute. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, let's talk a bit about immigration to Canada. The federal government has been criticized for its handling of the increasing number of asylum seekers illegally crossing our border from the United States. Also, how it's handled the Syrian refugees trying to integrate into our society. Canada does need immigrants, but how can we improve the system? Joining me now via Skype from Vancouver is Herbert Grubel, a former professor of economics at Simon Fraser University. He also served as a Reform Party MP for Capilano, BC back in the 1990s. Welcome to BCN.
Thank you very much, Hal.
Now, Canada likely does need more immigration considering our low birth rate. Any thoughts on what really needs to change in how we process immigrants so that we maybe make it a right fit for Canada?
Well, first of all, I disagree with the fact that we need more immigrants, but I don't want to devote the 15 minutes that we have to that topic. There's a much, much more important topic, a topic which the people who live outside of the big cities of Vancouver, Montreal, and Toronto are not aware of. We have a large number of immigrants that is so big that we are now suffering the consequences of mass immigration. I'm not against immigration. I am worried and I see the consequences of having mass immigration. Let me tell you what that implies. Every week, notice this, every week in Vancouver metropolitan area, 300 immigrant families are settling every week from now on until we change our policies. They have done this for the last 20 years.
Now, do we know where they're coming from? Is it from Syria, from Iraq, war-torn countries?
It doesn't matter. The topic is they have all been selected on the basis of being good economic contributors. They aren't. But the most important thing is, what is the greatest complaint that Canadians have about their country, about living in Vancouver, Toronto, and Montreal? It is high cost of housing. Where do these 300 families a week live? They add to the demand for housing, and they drive it up. They add to the demand for hospitals, for schools, for roads, for recreation facilities. And of course, people who love immigrants say, oh, all we have to do is build more infrastructure, build more housing. Well, we've been trying very hard to catch up with the demand for housing, but it's being driven up because in some areas in Vancouver, for example, are running out of land.
Well, and in Toronto as well, Mayor John Tory was really concerned about the amount of immigrants coming in. They had to put them in dorms, college dorms, because there was just no place to house them. And now, like you said, infrastructure has to be built in Toronto, Vancouver, Montreal, and a lot of the big centers here in Canada.
Well, and one reason why we're not building them is because our fiscal capacity is strained. And one of the most important books I've ever written was published by the Fraser Institute, which showed, using government statistics, that the average immigrant pays only 50% of the income taxes that the average Canadian does. But they demand the same amount of government services that the average Canadian demands. So we have a gap 5 years ago of 6,000 per immigrant per year. That adds up to a fiscal burden on you and me and everybody who's listening to this broadcast of over 30 billion a year. 30 billion a year. That is an enormous amount of money. That's more than we spend, much more than we spend on defense. So how do we get into this? Well, we're allegedly selecting immigrants on the basis of their education, their skills, their health, whether they're young and whatnot.
Or if they're persecuted, right? To get them away from their country persecution.
Yeah, but in fact, they represent 10% of the total. The other ones are allegedly pre-selected. Well, let me tell you, of those 300,000 a year, only a quarter are economically pre-selected. The rest are their spouses, their offspring, children under 20, and worst of all, their parents and grandparents, who not only don't contribute anything to output, but demand a lot of government services. So as a result of this, we get that $30 billion a year deficit. And we are simply not able to catch up in our construction of these infrastructure and housing to meet the demand so that we don't get stuck on the bridge every day.
Some immigration is good, however. I know when I first moved to Lethbridge, Alberta, there's a shortage of doctors. No doctors, not accepting any new patients. So we finally found a doctor who immigrated to Canada, is fairly new to Canada, has all of her credentials, and she's wonderful. So, I mean, in that regard, you do need some immigration here, and people who are professionals, but not those who come here that just end up on our social assistance programs.
No, it's not. Let's not say that there are any more social assistance needs for the immigrants. But, you know, the doctors, well, the 300 a week families are coming, they all need doctors, right? One reason why we have a doctor shortage is because we have millions of people who have come here, and a few of them are doctors, but we might not have any need for immigrant doctors if we didn't have all these immigrants that are demanding medical services. Now, let me also talk briefly, as you started off, this is a common perception that we need them as workers. Well, if
It helps the GDP, absolutely. More workers, right?
yeah, but why would I care about GDP? What you and I should be caring about is GDP per capita after taxes, right? So if I were an employer, I would certainly love lots and lots of immigrants who press down wages, and I can hire them more cheaply. So they are all in favor of it. But assume for a moment we didn't have immigrant workers to do this work. Well, what would happen? You'd have wages go up in the fields where now no Canadian wants to work. That's always the argument, you see. These immigrants fill jobs that no Canadian wants. Well, wages would go up. People would retire later. Younger people would start earlier. Labor force participation among women would increase because wages are higher. They would be higher because there wasn't all this supply pushing down the wages. So what else would happen? Well, you would get robots taken over everywhere. We already are seeing some of this. You look at McDonald's, they already have kiosks. They don't need any more cashiers. The supermarkets all have automatic cashiers. Soon, if the price of labor was high enough, we would have robots flipping the hamburgers.
But you know what? I think a lot of that's to do with technology as well nowadays, you know? A lot of it's technology, like in the banks, you've got the ATM machines. We're talking about autonomous vehicles now. So, I mean, it's just technology.
But that means we don't need these workers. It would work just as well. And in fact, what is happening is because the immigrants keep the wages so low, the incentives to install labor-saving devices is much less than it is in Japan and other places where they have low birth rates, but no immigration.
So let me ask you something. So you're against obviously the illegal immigrants crossing the border and, settling into different areas of the country, like we said. How about the ones like my parents? They came over from Europe. They went through the entire process. Those who are seeking to legally immigrate to Canada, what do you say to them? You want to keep them away as well?
No, I am not even against legal immigrants from Asia. What I am against is 300,000 or 350,000, as they are promising for next year, a year from India, wherever they want to come from. It's too much. Our economy can't handle it. The absorptive capacity is exceeded. So my argument is the biggest problem we have to face, and the biggest policy change I would recommend for Bernier was lower temporarily the number of immigrants to 100,000 and let us catch up, building roads, bridges, hospitals, etc., etc., until we can have a more normal life, we don't face all these problems, and then let's rediscuss whether we should have 100,000 or maybe even 50,000, or whether we should have 300,000.
There's another issue as well. The Federal Auditor General has criticized the government for its inability to track whether the 50,000 Syrian refugees have access to education or receiving social assistance. How many are working? How many have learned English or French? How did this happen? We lost track of those 50,000.
Well, I don't want to bash the Liberals and the bureaucracy, but you see, it is typical of people outside of the big cities, and also many of the immigrants, that you're concerned about the welfare of these illegal immigrants, of these refugees. That's a relatively minor issue. It's a matter of time before they're being taken care of. Very expensive, but they will be taken care of. We are losing track of the main issue, that we cannot absorb mass immigration of 300,000 a year 300 new families settling in the metropolitan area of Vancouver every week.
So you're really concerned about.
I'm not aware of this.
So you're concerned about the strain on the healthcare system, the education system, and
Road, housing,
taking jobs away. Is that those
no,
your biggest concerns?
No. As an economist, I must say that's not a problem. They all find work, but at wages which don't pay into enough tax payments to take care of all the benefits they're getting from the government. Even if they don't have an extra tendency to get welfare or anything of that sort than the average Canadian. It's simply a fiscal burden due to the fact that they don't have these incomes high enough. Even though we make every effort to select them, that they will. They are not, these are statistics that I give you. I don't make them up. They are officially available on Statistics Canada website.
So where do you think a lot of these refugees who want to claim asylum status here in Canada, fleeing persecution, where should they go instead of Canada?
Look, let's talk about refugee policy. There is wide agreement among people that I deal with who say, we are doing a very bad service to Syria. What we should be doing is, we should be spending a fraction of what they cost us in terms of fiscal burden and give it to the United Nations to run refugee camps in the Middle East. Let them be there until the war will end. And I can assure you, all wars end eventually. Then they will go back where they are needed much, much more than they are in North America to rebuild their country. We are not doing the people of Syria a service by taking the best, the brightest, the most energetic, the healthiest. We go into these refugee camps and pick them out and send them to Canada. We should responsibly finance and make life as comfortable as possible in these refugee camps and encourage them. And what they all want to do, they all want to go home to rebuild their country.
A lot of them, yeah, that's their big concern is when they come over to Canada, they have to integrate, learn a new language, integrate into our culture. And that's a real challenge for a lot of these new refugees.
Well, I'm not an expert on the psychology and problems of refugees. I can understand it. But they will all overcome it eventually, and their children will be doing fine. So that I think is, again, a problem that is concerned to those many compassionate Canadians who are so proud of their culture of compassion to the rest of the world. But the rest of the world is so big. The numbers that we are taking are so small. And the harm we're doing to the rebuilding of these countries by taking their best and brightest to come to Canada, it outweighs these concerns. We're actually doing harm. False application of compassion.
When I lived in the Niagara region in southern Ontario, a lot of business owners I knew there, they hired a lot of Mexican immigrants to come in and pick the apples because nobody else wanted to do that job specifically, and they were very thankful for the work that they had. So what do you say to those business owners that say, no, I like bringing in the immigrants because they have a wonderful service for my business?
Of course. If I were a businessman, I would also, and I would lobby Ottawa to continue and increase the numbers. But the fact is, the reason they can't get workers is because they don't pay enough. And the wages they are forced to pay are being kept down because these workers are there. If they couldn't find any workers, which is doubtful, we would also have machinery to pick everything. In California, when they prevented agricultural workers from picking tomatoes, they developed tomato picking machines. And when the tomato picking machines punctured and destroyed the tomato, damaged the tomatoes badly enough, they developed tomatoes which were resistant to this. And today, labor shortages may be there, but the tomato industry is saved. Same way the Apple industry will be saved.
Former Simon Fraser Economics University professor Herbert Grubel, thanks a lot for joining me today from Vancouver.
My pleasure. Thank you.
On behalf of all of us here at BCN, I'm Hal Roberts. God bless and have a great night.